Now we are going to start pediatric surgery, and in pediatric surgery first we are going to discuss the bronchogenic cyst. Bronchogenic cyst originates as sequestration of ventral foregut, and you know this ventral foregut is an antecedent of tracheobronchial tree, means the tracheobronchial tree is going to develop from ventral foregut. So see the important points one by one. Bronchogenic cyst originates as sequestrations. It originates as sequestrations from ventral foregut. Ventral foregut. Clear? And ventral foregut is an antecedent of tracheobronchial tree. What is the pathognomonic of bronchogenic cyst? That it is lined by inner layer of ciliated respiratory epithelium. So what's the lining? It is lined by inner layer of ciliated respiratory epithelium. Okay, and this is pathognomonic. This feature is pathognomonic of bronchogenic cyst. You have to remember. So this is pathognomonic. Okay, we discussed bronchogenic cyst in thorax also, and we discussed what's the most common location of bronchogenic cyst. It is medial mediastinum. Most common site or location. The most common location is medial mediastinum. Right? Now see, what are the types of bronchogenic cyst? It is of two types, mediastinal and parenchymal. Parenchymal is also known as intrapulmonary. Okay, so mediastinal type doesn't communicate with tracheobronchial tree. What are the types included in mediastinal variety? Subcarinal, right paratracheal and hilar. Clear? These are included in mediastinal, and in intrapulmonary or parenchymal it is typically perihilar. Okay, so see what are the differences. There are two types. One is mediastinal and the second is intrapulmonary, and this is also known as parenchymal. Okay, so it is self-explanatory that if it is mediastinal, it doesn't communicate with tracheobronchial tree. So mediastinal variety, it doesn't communicate with tracheobronchial tree. Whereas this parenchymal variety, this type communicates with tracheobronchial tree. So it communicates with tracheobronchial tree. What are the types included in mediastinal variety? We discussed subcarinal, paratracheal and hilar. So the varieties which are included, it is subcarinal, right paratracheal and hilar. Clear? These are mediastinal, and generally parenchymal variety or intrapulmonary, these are typically perihilar. So these are typically perihilar. Now see the clinical manifestations. Majority of patients who are having bronchogenic cyst, the patients are asymptomatic. If the patient is symptomatic, the symptoms are dependent on the location and the type. Imagine if a patient is having this variety, which one? Right paratracheal. So it is paratracheal, so it is going to compress the trachea, and because of compression of trachea, what's the symptom? Respiratory distress. If patient is having intrapulmonary variety, and what happens? There is infection. Because of infection, what's the manifestation? There is fever and there is cough. Clear? So see what are the clinical features. Majority of patients are asymptomatic. Symptoms are dependent on the type and the location. Imagine that patient is having right paratracheal bronchogenic cyst. So if it's right paratracheal, there is compression of trachea. So what's the symptom? Patient might develop respiratory distress. Clear? And if there is infection located in lung parenchyma, and because of this infection, patient might present to you with what? There can be fever or cough. So there can be fever or cough. Now how we are going to make the diagnosis? See, if we are going for chest x-ray, you will notice that there is presence of dense mass. But for better anatomical delineation, we go for CT or MRI. How it looks on chest x-ray? See, so here you can see this is the right paratracheal bronchogenic cyst, and can you see the appearance? Yes, it is looking like dense mass. So on chest x-ray, the appearance, it appears as dense mass. Clear? So we may go for chest x-ray, and on chest x-ray there is presence of dense mass. So can you see typical location? This is which type? Right paratracheal. But for better anatomical delineation, we go for CT or MRI. CT or MRI is done for better anatomical delineation. What's the treatment? In all cases, we go for surgical excision. Why? Because we want to prevent the complication. Second, for symptomatic relief if the patient is having symptom. And third, for histological confirmation that the patient is having bronchogenic cyst. So see the treatment. In all patients, we go for surgical excision. Surgical excision is done in all patients. So why it's done in all patients? First, to prevent complications. To prevent complications. Second, for symptomatic relief. Symptomatic relief. And third, very important, for histological confirmation. Clear? So this is how we manage the patients of bronchogenic cyst. Now we are going to discuss pulmonary sequestration. So it is pulmonary sequestration, means it's a malformation of lung without bronchial communication, and there is aberrant systemic vascular supply. So it's a malformation of lung. And what kind of malformation? There is no bronchial communication. Important points. So there is no bronchial communication. Okay. And there is aberrant. Aberrant means abnormal origin. So there is aberrant systemic vascular supply. Okay, aberrant systemic vascular supply. Simple. Now see, what's the most common site of pulmonary sequestration? So it's the posterior-basal segment of left lower lung. Most common site. This is frequently asked question, and it is asked in pediatrics also. It's the posterior-basal segment of which lung? Left lower lung. Posterior-basal segment of left lower lung. Now see what is the presentation. In majority of cases, there is recurrent chest infections. And you know, for most of the chest related conditions, what is the investigation of choice for diagnosis? It is CCT. So here also we go for CCT. So two important points. One related to clinical features. These patients present with recurrent chest infections. Recurrent chest infections. Okay. And what's the investigation of choice for diagnosis? It is CCT. Now see what are the types of pulmonary sequestration. So in this image you can see it is of two types. First, it is intralobar. Intralobar means it is located within the lung parenchyma. So within the lung parenchyma. And second, you can see this is extralobar. Can you see? So it is located outside the normal lung. And another feature which is there in this extralobar pulmonary sequestration, that there is separate pleural covering. So this extralobar sequestration, it is having separate pleural covering. Now focus on the blood supply. In both you can see that there is aberrant systemic blood supply. Can you see here? There is a single artery arising from aorta, directly arising from aorta, supplying the intralobar sequestration. And here you can see one artery and there are multiple branches, and it is going to supply the extralobar sequestration. So let's discuss what are the differences. Intralobar means located within the lung parenchyma, and extralobar means it is located outside the normal lung. Intralobar located within the lung parenchyma, and the arterial supply, you saw that there is aberrant artery directly arising from aorta. The venous drainage, you have to remember, the venous drainage goes to inferior pulmonary vein. Now, what is the problem with intralobar pulmonary sequestration? That there is increased risk of infection and bleeding. Since there is increased risk of infection and bleeding, in all cases we have to go for surgical excision. So either we go for segmentectomy or we go for lobectomy. Extralobar sequestration located outside the normal lung, and we discussed that there is a separate pleural covering also. Here also arterial supply is aberrant arising from aorta. Sometimes there is a single artery which is going to supply, and sometimes there are multiple arteries. What you have to notice that there is systemic venous drainage, and this venous drainage goes to azygous, hemiazygous, azygous vein, hemiazygous vein, or directly it goes into vena cava. Most of the patients who are having extralobar pulmonary sequestration, those patients are asymptomatic, and that's why what's the management here? Only observation is required. So only observation in patients of extralobar pulmonary sequestration, but in patients of intralobar pulmonary sequestration we go for segmentectomy or lobectomy. Why? Because these patients are prone to develop infection and bleeding. In this picture what you can see that there is abnormally elevated position of diaphragm. And what's the name of this condition? This is known as eventration of diaphragm. So what's the name of this condition? This is eventration of diaphragm. Clear? So here you can notice that there is abnormally elevated position of diaphragm. And what's the cause? It's because of either paralysis or atrophy of muscle fibers. So what's the cause? There is abnormally elevated position of diaphragm. It can be because of paralysis or atrophy of muscle fibers. Atrophy of muscle fibers. Okay. There are two types of eventration. One is congenital and the second is acquired. Clear? Now see, what is the nerve supply of diaphragm? It is supplied by phrenic nerve. So whenever there is dysfunction of phrenic nerve because of trauma, because of neuromuscular disorders, in those cases also you will find what? Diaphragmatic eventation. Second, there is birth trauma which is more common in breech presentation, and birth trauma can also lead to diaphragmatic eventation or eventation of diaphragm. Overall, which one is the most common cause of acquired eventation of diaphragm? It's a birth trauma. So what are the types of eventation of diaphragm? It is of two types. One is congenital and the second is acquired. The congenital variety is because of failure of muscularization of dome of diaphragm. That's why there is abnormally elevated diaphragm. And the acquired eventation is because of dysfunction of phrenic nerve. It can occur because of trauma or neuromuscular disorders. And if you see, what's the most common cause of acquired eventation of diaphragm? And that is what? Birth trauma. And we discussed that this birth trauma is more common in breech presentation. So it's more common in breech presentation. Clear? Now see, generally this eventation of diaphragm, here you can see it is more common on which side? Left side. Generally it is more common in males and it is more common in pediatric population. So left side more common in males and more common in pediatric population. Okay, there are two treatment options available for eventation. Either we can go for plication or we can go for resection. So which one is preferred? Plication is preferred over resection. So see the treatment. Plication is preferred over resection. And generally, whenever we are performing the surgery, diaphragm is fixed during inspiration or expiration. So it is fixed during inspiration. So during surgery, diaphragm, it's fixed in inspiration. This is fixed in inspiration. So what's the advantages of fixing it in inspiration? Advantage is that it is going to minimize the paradoxical movement and mediastinal shift. So what's the advantage? It minimizes paradoxical movement. It minimizes paradoxical movement and mediastinal shift. Clear? So this is how we manage the patients of eventration of diaphragm. Now we are going to discuss tracheoesophageal fistula. So what is fistula? Fistula is communication between two epithelium lined surfaces. So what is tracheoesophageal fistula? It's the communication between trachea and esophagus. And generally this tracheoesophageal fistula is associated with esophageal atresia also. Okay, so in this case there is communication between trachea. There is communication between trachea and esophagus. One point. Second, that it is generally associated with esophageal atresia. Okay, this condition is more common in males. So it is associated with esophageal atresia and it is more common in males. There is one question which is frequently asked in relation to tracheoesophageal fistula, and that is what? Classification. So tracheoesophageal fistula is divided into 5 types. Type A, B, C, D, E. So see the types. If you see the type A, this type A is pure esophageal atresia. Can you see here? This is pure esophageal atresia. There is no tracheoesophageal fistula. If you see this type B, in this, apart from esophageal atresia, can you see there is fistula, and the fistula is between the proximal part of esophagus and trachea. So this is known as proximal tracheoesophageal fistula. So what is type B? This is esophageal atresia with proximal tracheoesophageal fistula. And if you see this type C, in this type C there is esophageal atresia with distal tracheoesophageal fistula. So this is esophageal atresia with distal tracheoesophageal fistula. And in type D there is esophageal atresia with fistula, and there is both proximal as well as distal fistula. So can you see here, there is proximal fistula also and there is distal fistula also. Proximal means fistula between proximal part of esophagus. So proximal tracheoesophageal fistula means fistula between proximal part of esophagus and trachea. And can you see distal? So distal means there is fistula between distal part of esophagus and trachea. So here there is esophageal atresia with both proximal and distal tracheoesophageal fistula. This is type D. If you see type E, in type E there is no esophageal atresia, there is only tracheoesophageal fistula. So here you can see that there is only fistula, there is no atresia. And what is the other name of type E? It is H-shaped fistula. So here it is tracheoesophageal fistula without esophageal atresia. Clear? And the other name, can you see how it looks like? H. So that's why it's known as H-shaped tracheoesophageal fistula. So this is H-shaped tracheoesophageal fistula. Now the frequently asked question related to this classification: out of A, B, C, D, E, which one is most common type? So the most common type is type C, and they ask the description. So which one is most common type? It's the esophageal atresia with distal tracheoesophageal fistula. And what is the least common type? Least common type is type D. So most common type is type C and the least common type is type D, in which there is esophageal atresia with fistula, both proximal as well as distal tracheoesophageal fistula. So this is the classification. So let's quickly revise. Type A was isolated esophageal atresia. Type B was esophageal atresia with proximal tracheoesophageal fistula. Type C, esophageal atresia with distal tracheoesophageal fistula, and this was most common type. In type D, there was both proximal and distal tracheoesophageal fistula. It was least common type. And type E was having only tracheoesophageal fistula without any esophageal atresia. And what's the other name? It is also known as H-shaped fistula. H-shaped fistula. Okay, now see, generally this tracheoesophageal fistula or GI abnormalities, congenital GI abnormalities, these are associated with polyhydramnios. So one of the indirect evidence of congenital GI abnormalities is what? Polyhydramnios. So here also there is maternal history of polyhydramnios. Now see, it's very easy to understand the clinical features of tracheoesophageal fistula and esophageal atresia. First, since there is esophageal atresia, so whatever the saliva is going, yes, it is not going beyond this point. That's why there is continuous drooling of saliva by the corner of mouth. One problem. Second, whatever the feed is given to the baby orally, what happens? There is regurgitation. So there is regurgitation of oral feed. These are seen in the patients who are having esophageal atresia. Second, if the patient is having tracheoesophageal fistula, whatever the food is going into the esophagus, what happens? See, the food enters into trachea. And if the food enters into trachea or even saliva enters into trachea, these patients are having what? Choking, coughing, cyanosis and dyspnea. So see the clinical features, easy to understand. Clinical features. So if patient is having esophageal atresia, in these cases, what happens? There is continuous drooling of saliva. So there is continuous drooling of saliva from mouth. Okay, and second, there is regurgitation of oral feed. Regurgitation of oral feed. Right? And if patient is having tracheoesophageal fistula, right? So in such patients, what's the problem? These patients have choking, coughing, cyanosis and dyspnea. So there is choking, there is coughing, cyanosis and dyspnea. Clear? So these are the manifestations. Now how to make the diagnosis? Imagine that I'm going to insert the Ryle's tube. If I'm going to insert the Ryle's tube, obviously I'm not able to insert the Ryle's tube into the stomach. So inability of nasogastric insertion into the stomach. Why? Because if you'll try to insert the Ryle's tube or nasogastric tube, can you see it is going to coil where? Into the esophagus. So the coiling will occur into the esophagus. So you cannot insert the nasogastric tube into stomach and the coiling will occur into esophagus. So this is suggestive of what? Esophageal atresia. One problem. Second, if we are going for X-ray, on X-ray you can see the coiling into the proximal part of esophagus and you are not able to insert it into stomach. Second, on X-ray, if there is absence of gas distally, means in GIT if there is no gas, it means there is esophageal atresia. And if there is presence of gas, see the problem, if you are not able to insert the nasogastric tube, it means what? There is esophageal atresia. But what you noticed on X-ray, that there is presence of gas in GIT, means in the stomach, in intestine, there is presence of gas. It is suggestive of what? Tracheoesophageal fistula. Okay, so see how we diagnose the patients of tracheoesophageal fistula. Diagnosis. So first important point, inability to insert nasogastric tube into stomach. Nasogastric tube into stomach, okay, with coiling in esophagus. So there is coiling in esophagus. Clear? And this is suggestive of what? Esophageal atresia. One point. Second important point, presence of gas below diaphragm. So if there is presence of gas in GIT below diaphragm, clear? So this is suggestive of what? Tracheoesophageal fistula. Simple. And now just combine these two. If you're going to combine these two, inability to insert nasogastric tube into stomach with absence of gas in GIT below diaphragm, it means this patient is having esophageal atresia without tracheoesophageal fistula. Now see, previously isotonic contrast was used for the diagnosis of esophageal atresia and tracheoesophageal fistula. But what is the problem with isotonic contrast? If you are using this isotonic contrast and you don't know whether patient is having tracheoesophageal fistula or not, what will be the problem? There is aspiration. So it leads to aspiration in patients of tracheoesophageal fistula. That's why use of isotonic contrast is highly discouraged. So we should not use it. It is highly discouraged. And why we discourage it? Because of increased risk of aspiration. So generally we make the diagnosis by X-ray. We insert the Rice tube. One question which was asked in AIIMS as well as in NEET PG, that investigation of choice for diagnosis of H-shaped fistula. See how it looks like. So you can see this is type E, also known as H-shaped fistula. Clear? And how we are going to confirm the diagnosis in H-shaped fistula? So for evaluation of trachea, we go for tracheobronchoscopy. For trachea, we go for tracheobronchoscopy. Okay, and for assessment of esophagus, what? We go for upper GI endoscopy. So this is what? Endoscopy. Okay, so how the diagnosis of H-shaped fistula is confirmed, or type E fistula is confirmed? The diagnosis is confirmed by tracheobronchoscopy plus endoscopy. Clear? So this is how we are going to confirm the diagnosis of tracheoesophageal fistula. There is one association which is frequently asked in relation to tracheoesophageal fistula. And what's that association? It's association with Vacteral anomalies. Okay, so the anomalies which are associated with tracheoesophageal fistula, that is Vacteral anomalies. Now see the full form. V means vertebral body segmentation defects. A, anal atresia. C, cardiovascular anomalies. T, tracheoesophageal fistula. R, renal abnormalities. And L, limb anomalies. Okay, so see the questions related to these anomalies. First, out of Vacteral anomalies, which one is most common? So this is the cardiovascular anomaly. It's the cardiovascular anomaly which is most commonly associated with tracheoesophageal fistula. Another question, which cardiovascular anomaly? So it is generally associated with VSD, ventricular septal defect, and patent ductus arteriosus. Okay, and out of ventricular septal defect and patent ductus arteriosus, overall which one is most common? So the most common abnormality is ventricular septal defect. So I'm repeating two questions. In tracheoesophageal fistula, most common abnormality is cardiovascular, and in cardiovascular the most common abnormality is ventricular septal defect. What kind of renal abnormality is seen? These patients are having unilateral renal agenesis. So what's there? There is unilateral renal agenesis. Simple. And what kind of limb anomalies is there? So there is radial ray hypoplasia. So it is radial ray hypoplasia. Okay, so this is Vacteral anomalies, and these anomalies are associated with tracheoesophageal fistula. Now see the important points related to management. Initially or previously there was one criteria which was used in relation to management, and it was Waterston criteria. What was the name? The name of criteria was Waterston criteria. Okay, this was in relation to the management of tracheoesophageal fistula, but nowadays we are not using this Waterston criteria. So this criteria is not used nowadays. You have to remember the name. Okay, it is very easy to understand the management. See, first we are going to discuss the management of type A. See here, if the gap between both ends of esophagus, if it's small, then what we go for tension free esophagostomy. If there is a small gap, suppose this is the upper end, this is the lower end, we go for tension free esophagostomy. But the patients who are having large gap, in these patients, what happens when they swallow saliva goes into the proximal part of esophagus. So over a period of time, there is increase in the length and the gap reduces over a period of time. So if the gap is large in such patient, we are going to create what? Feeding gastrostomy. So we create feeding gastrostomy and then we go for delayed tension-free esophagostomy. Clear? So see, for type A, if there is small gap, in these patients we go for tension free esophagostomy. Clear? So proximal and distal ends are sutured. It should be tension free. And if there is large gap, so in such patients, first we go for feeding gastrostomy. So we go for feeding gastrostomy. And after feeding gastrostomy, we go for delayed tension-free esophagostomy. This is for type A. Right? Now see, for type B, type C and type D, the management is similar. Type B, type C, type D. In all these types, there is both esophageal atresia and tracheoesophageal fistula. So what we do? You can see that I am going to excise the fistula. Can you see? Excise the fistula tract. Excise the fistula tract. So excise the fistula tract. Clear? Second, what? Perform tension-free esophagostomy. Okay, so for type B, type C, type D, what we do? Excision of fistula tract. Excision of fistula tract. Okay, plus tension-free esophagostomy. This is for BCD. In type E, there is no esophageal atresia. There is only fistula. So what we do? We are going to excise the fistula tract. And whatever the defect is there, we are going to close the defect or repair the defect. So for type E, what? Excision of fistula tract. Excision of fistula tract. And what else we do? Plus repair of defect. Repair of defect. Clear? So this is how we are going to manage the patients of tracheoesophageal fistula. Now coming to the prognosis. So see, mortality in tracheoesophageal fistula, it's related to the abnormalities. So if the patient is having chromosomal abnormality, if the patient is having cardiovascular abnormality, these are the causes responsible for death or mortality. So important point related to prognosis. Prognosis in tracheoesophageal fistula. So in these patients, the mortality is related to, here mortality, it's related to cardiac defects and chromosomal abnormalities. Chromosomal abnormalities. Simple. Now we are going to discuss biliary atresia, and you know that in biliary atresia there is progressive obliteration of both intrahepatic and extrahepatic bile duct. So first important point, that it is characterized by progressive obliteration. Progressive obliteration of both intrahepatic bile duct as well as extrahepatic bile duct. Clear? There is another question which is asked, that what's the incidence of biliary atresia? It is 1 in 12,000 live births. 1 in 12,000. In these cases, etiology is unknown. And one famous question of AIIMS and NEET, most common indication of pediatric liver transplantation, and that is what? Biliary atresia. So what's the incidence? Incidence, it's 1 in 12,000 live births. Okay, there is unknown etiology. Unknown etiology. And the question which is frequently asked, that this is the most common indication. Biliary atresia is the most common indication of pediatric liver transplantation. It's the pediatric liver transplantation. Important points. Now see, this biliary atresia is asked in pathology also. It is asked in pediatrics also. It is asked in surgery also. So see important points related to pathology. So pathological hallmark. So in biliary atresia, there is bile duct proliferation. There is severe cholestasis with plugging. And what happens? There is inflammatory cell infiltrate. And all these changes are going to progress to cirrhosis. And if patient is going to develop cirrhosis, further it can lead to portal hypertension and hepatic failure. So what? It can lead to portal hypertension and hepatic failure. Clear? So here, timely treatment should be done. Now see the problem. 3 important points related to biliary atresia. First, medical therapy cannot reverse the process. First important point, medical therapy cannot reverse the process of biliary atresia. It means in all patients what is required? Surgical intervention. And if surgical intervention is not done, death occurs within 2 years. In absence of surgical intervention, death occurs in 2 years in all patients. Suppose we are going for surgical intervention for better long-term survival. The surgery should be done within 60 days of birth. So what? Timely surgical treatment is the key point of management. So here you can see that in type 1, CBD is obliterated. Can you see? CBD is obliterated, and you can see this common hepatic duct and this cystic duct, it is patent. So what's type 1? CBD is obliterated with patent cystic duct and common hepatic duct. In type 2A, can you see there is atresia of which part of bile duct? Common hepatic duct. So here there is atresia of common hepatic duct with patent CBD and cystic duct. This is type 2A. And see type 2B. In type 2B, you can see there is obliteration of CBD, there is obliteration of common hepatic duct as well as cystic duct. So in type 2B, there is obliteration of CBD, common hepatic duct and cystic duct. And if you see this type 3, this is most common type, responsible for more than 90% of the cases. Here there is atresia of CBD, cystic duct and hepatic duct till which point? This is porta. So till porta hepatis. Till porta hepatis. So type 3, in this there is atresia of CBD, cystic duct, hepatic duct up to the porta hepatis, and the type 3 is most common type, responsible for more than 90% cases. So let's quickly revise. Type 1 is obliterated CBD with patent proximal bile duct, means common hepatic duct and cystic duct. Type 2A, there is atresia of common hepatic duct with patent cystic duct and CBD. Type 2B, there is obliteration of common hepatic duct, cystic duct and CBD. And in type 3, which is most common type, responsible for more than 90% cases, there is atresia of CBD, cystic duct and hepatic duct up to the porta hepatis. Now coming to the clinical features. So what is the problem here? There is obliteration of both intrahepatic as well as extrahepatic bile duct, and because of that there is obstruction to the bile flow. So directly or indirectly the patient is having obstructive jaundice. So what? Just after birth or after some days of birth, patient is going to develop jaundice. And since it is obstructive jaundice, there is passage of pale acholic stools. So passage of clay colored stools. Third, there is failure to thrive. So what are the clinical features? Because of obstructive jaundice, there is jaundice. Sometimes it's present at birth, and in certain patients it is going to develop after certain days. There is passage of acholic, pale gray stools. Why? Because of obstruction to the bile flow. And there is failure to thrive. Failure to thrive. We discussed that timely surgical intervention should be done, and generally it should be done within 60 days. Imagine that there is delay in diagnosis or there is delay in surgical intervention in these patients. There are signs and symptoms of portal hypertension and hepatic failure. So if there is delay in diagnosis or surgical intervention, so there is presence of signs and symptoms of portal hypertension and hepatic failure. There are certain malformations which are associated with biliary atresia. So what are the malformations which are associated with biliary atresia? It is associated with polysplenia, malrotation, pre-duodenal portal vein, and intrahepatic vena cava. This question was asked in PGI Chandigarh. Polysplenia, malrotation, pre-duodenal portal vein, and intrahepatic vena cava. So these are the associations. Now coming to the diagnosis. The question is asked, what is the gold standard investigation for diagnosis of biliary atresia? And the students are having some confusion that whether this is liver biopsy or some other investigation. See, it's not the liver biopsy. Why? Because liver biopsy is highly accurate, but there is no pathognomonic feature of biliary atresia in biopsy. So the gold standard investigation for diagnosis of biliary atresia is intraoperative or peroperative cholangiogram, which is also known as cholecystocholangiogram. So you have to remember, very, very important, what is the gold standard investigation for diagnosis of biliary atresia. Biliary atresia, this question was asked minimum 5 to 6 times. So you have to remember, it's intraoperative. Sometimes in exam they mention peroperative cholangiogram, and sometimes in exam it's given cholecystocholangiogram. So what? Cholecystocholangiogram. Clear? Now see the reference. It is given in Blumgart, and Blumgart is the Bible of hepatobiliary surgery. So see this. This is the Blumgart. Okay. Now see what's written in this Blumgart. So despite these advancement in non-invasive imaging of hepatobiliary anatomy, intraoperative cholangiography, can you see? Intraoperative cholangiography remains the gold standard for diagnosis of biliary atresia. So intraoperative cholangiography remains the gold standard for diagnosing biliary atresia. Now see, preoperative liver biopsy has become an increasingly safe used method to help exclude other causes of neonatal jaundice. So with the help of liver biopsy, we can exclude other causes. Although percutaneous liver biopsy is highly accurate, but no histologic findings are pathognomonic for biliary atresia. So there is no confusion now. What is the gold standard investigation for diagnosis of biliary atresia? Intraoperative or peroperative cholangiogram, also known as cholecystocholangiogram, we can make the diagnosis by liver biopsy. It's highly accurate, but no histologic findings are pathognomonic of biliary atresia. Imagine we are going to perform ultrasound. What are the findings on ultrasound? You will notice that there is shrunken gallbladder and CBD is not visible. So what? There is shrunken gallbladder and CBD, it's not visible. In exams, they are asking certain signs which are seen on ultrasound. First, there is gallbladder ghost triad, and second, there is triangle cord sign. So what are the signs? Gallbladder ghost triad, and there is presence of triangle cord sign. Triangle cord sign. Imagine that we are performing hepatobiliary scintigraphy. We discussed the concept of scintigraphy, that whenever you are going to give any radionuclide, it is taken by Kupffer cells of the liver and then it is being excreted into the bile. So what you will see, that generally you are going to notice that the uptake is there in the liver. Imagine you are going for scintigraphy. So initially there is uptake in the liver. Later, these agents are going where? Into the bile duct and then into the intestine. So you will notice the uptake in the liver and then you will notice the flow of radiotracer into the intestine. What is the problem in biliary atresia? Since there is obstruction, obliteration of intrahepatic and extrahepatic bile duct, so there will be uptake in the liver. But what? There is no flow into the duodenum. So uptake of tracer into the liver without any flow into the duodenum or small intestine is suggestive of what? Biliary atresia. So in this picture you can see that there is uptake in the liver and slowly can you see the radiotracer is going where? Into the intestine. So this is normal. Now see, this is the case of biliary atresia. After 30 minutes you notice that there is uptake only in the liver, and what, even at 60 minutes there is uptake but there is no flow into the intestine. So this is the finding which is seen in biliary atresia, uptake of radiotracer into the liver without any flow into the intestine. Now see the treatment. So in these patients we perform exploratory laparotomy, and after exploratory laparotomy we discussed we go for the gold standard investigation. What is that? Intraoperative cholecystocholangiogram. So followed by intraoperative cholecystocholangiogram. Okay, so question which is very important, that why we perform intraoperative cholecystocholangiogram. So intraoperative cholecystocholangiogram, it is performed to confirm the diagnosis. We discussed that this is the gold standard investigation. Second, it demonstrates the fibrotic biliary remnant, and we have to define that which part is patent and which part is not having any patency, right? So it is going to define the proximal and distal bile duct patency. So this is the role of intraoperative cholecystocholangiogram. What is the treatment of choice? The name of surgery, it is known as Kasai portoenterostomy. This is Kasai portoenterostomy. Okay, this is the treatment of choice. Porto. Okay, so at porta hepatis we are going to attach a part of small bowel. See how it's done. Very easy to understand. So this is what stomach, this is what duodenum, this is what jejunum. Simple. Here you can see this is the liver, this is the gallbladder, this is the bile duct. Now there is progressive obliteration. So what happens? We are going to remove the gallbladder as well as bile duct. So we are going to remove the gallbladder and bile duct. Okay, clear? And we are going to divide jejunum. So here we are going to divide the jejunum. After dividing the jejunum, you can see that this is the proximal part, this is the distal part. We are taking this distal part here. Okay, and the proximal part is anastomos to side of jejunum. So what is the final diagram? This is the liver. Okay, in this you perform the portoenterostomy. So this is a loop of jejunum attached to porta hepatis. Here you can see that this is the stomach, this is the duodenum, and this is what? Jejunum. So this jejunum is anastomosed to side of jejunum. So this is jejunosterostomy, and this anastomosis is portoenterostomy. Portoenterostomy, also known as hepatoportoenterostomy. So here you can see this is how it looks like. So this is the treatment of choice known as Kasai portoenterostomy. So this is the surgical treatment. In post-operative period, we have to give certain drugs. In post-operative period, we give the combination of ursodeoxycholic acid plus methylprednisolone plus trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole. Why we give ursodeoxycholic acid? Because it facilitates bile flow. It facilitates bile flow. Okay. Why we give methylprednisolone? It is steroid. So this is an anti-inflammatory agent. So acts as an anti-inflammatory agent, right? And the most common post-operative complication is cholangitis. So what? This antibiotic is given for antimicrobial prophylaxis. Okay, so this combination is given. Despite of this, what happens? The most common post-operative complication, it's cholangitis. So what's the most common post-operative complication? And that's cholangitis. And we discussed three principles. First, that no medical treatment can reverse the process of biliary atresia. Second, so surgical intervention is mandatory. If surgery is not done, death occurs within 2 years. And generally, for better survival and for better outcome, the surgery should be done within 60 days of birth. And see, if surgery is done within 60 days of birth, generally 30% patients are not going to require liver transplantation and they have better survival. So there is long-term successful survival and they don't require liver transplantation. How many? 30% of patients in whom the surgical intervention is done within 60 days. Now see two important factors which affect the outcome of portoenterostomy or hepatoportoenterostomy. So see the outcome of portoenterostomy. It is dependent on many factors, but the two factors which are asked in exam, first, that what is the age in days at diagnosis and at surgical intervention. So first, age in days at diagnosis and at surgical intervention. So if there is early diagnosis and surgical intervention done within 30 to 60 days, it is associated with good prognosis. Second, size of microscopic duct at porta hepatis. Size of microscopic duct at porta hepatis. If the size, you have to remember this value, this was asked 2 to 3 times. If the size is more than 150 micron, it is associated with good prognosis. Surgical intervention done within 30 to 60 days. Size of microscopic duct more than 150 micron. Both of these are associated with good prognosis. Now we are going to discuss intestinal atresia. So what is the most common site of intestinal atresia? It is the duodenum. And second important point, what is the most common cause of neonatal intestinal obstruction? And that is duodenal atresia. So two important points. First, what's the most common site of intestinal atresia. Okay, so the most common site of intestinal atresia, and this is what? Duodenum. Okay, it's the duodenum. And the second important point, that what's the most common site of neonatal intestinal obstruction? So second statement, most common cause of neonatal intestinal obstruction. Neonatal intestinal obstruction. Okay, and that is duodenal atresia. It's the duodenal atresia. Clear? So we are going to discuss duodenal atresia in detail. So what's the cause? Duodenal atresia results from failure of vacuolization from its solid cord stage. So what's the cause? It results from failure of vacuolization. Failure of vacuolization from its solid cord stage. See the types of duodenal atresia. So there are three types of duodenal atresia. If you see the type 1, here you are going to notice that there is presence of mucosal web or duodenal diaphragm, and this is known as windsock deformity. So what's type 1? In type 1 there is presence of mucosal web or duodenal diaphragm. So mucosal web or duodenal diaphragm, and this is known as windsock deformity. So in type 1 there is windsock deformity. Clear? If you see this type 2, here you can notice that the two ends are separated by a fibrous cord. Can you see here? So this is a fibrous cord, and here ends are separated by fibrous cord. And if you see the type 3, here there is complete separation of two ends. So in type 2, the ends are separated by two ends are separated by fibrous cord. Okay, fibrous cord. And in type 3 there is complete separation. So here you can see that in type 3 there is complete separation of the two ends. So these are the three types. Type 1, duodenal, there is presence of duodenal diaphragm, mucosal web, which is also known as windsock deformity. Windsock deformity. Type 2, in which two ends are separated by fibrous cord, and in type 3 there is complete separation of ends. Now see what are the conditions associated with duodenal atresia. So conditions which are associated with duodenal atresia. This list is very important. So the conditions associated are Down syndrome, annular pancreas, we discussed this in annular pancreas, malrotation, biliary atresia, prematurity, and polyhydramnios. You know that any congenital GI abnormality, generally it is having association with polyhydramnios. So these are the associations. How to remember? So the mnemonic is DAM-BP. What's the mnemonic? Mnemonic is DAM-BP. Clear? So it is DAM-BP. Down syndrome, annular pancreas, malrotation, biliary atresia, prematurity, polyhydramnios. Okay, we discussed annular pancreas. Now see what is the similarity with annular pancreas. So if you see, this is the stomach, this is the duodenum, this is the bile duct, and this is the pancreas, and this is the opening into duodenum, that's ampulla. Generally, in annular pancreas, where is the obstruction? It is proximal to ampulla. So the obstruction in annular pancreas is proximal to ampulla, and if you see the duodenal atresia, the obstruction is distal to ampulla. So in both annular pancreas and duodenal atresia, there is vomiting. Which one is having bilious vomiting? So in duodenal atresia, there is bilious vomiting. Clear? And in annular pancreas, since the obstruction is proximal to ampulla, here it's non-bilious. So in this case, there is non-bilious vomiting. So coming to the clinical features, yes, what kind of vomiting is seen in duodenal atresia? So these patients have bilious vomiting. In annular pancreas, we discussed the concept of single bubble, double bubble, triple bubble also. So see, in cases of annular pancreas and duodenal atresia, which sign is seen? Here we find double bubble sign on X-ray. So here you can see the X-ray of a patient having double bubble sign. This is stomach, and this is what? Duodenum. Double bubble sign is seen in both annular pancreas as well as duodenal atresia. Single bubble sign is seen in hypertrophic pyloric stenosis, and we discussed triple bubble sign is seen in jejunal atresia. So these are the three important one-liners questions: single bubble in hypertrophic pyloric stenosis, double bubble sign in annular pancreas and duodenal atresia, and triple bubble sign is seen in jejunal atresia. Now coming to the treatment. See, for both annular pancreas as well as duodenal atresia, the treatment of choice is duodeno-duodenostomy. And there is a third condition known as superior mesenteric artery syndrome. And for superior mesenteric artery syndrome, what is the treatment of choice? Duodeno-jejunostomy. So another question. So here you can see, for duodenal atresia and annular pancreas, the treatment of choice is duodeno-duodenostomy. And for superior mesenteric artery syndrome, what's the treatment of choice? It is the duodeno-jejunostomy. In duodenal atresia, what kind of duodeno-duodenostomy is done? It is diamond shaped. See how it's done? So here you can see we give incision in the proximal and distal end, and this is what? Diamond shaped. So this is diamond shaped duodeno-duodenostomy. So this is diamond shaped duodeno-duodenostomy, which is the treatment of choice for duodenal atresia. There are 5 D's associated with duodenal atresia. So what are the 5 D's? Duodenal atresia, Down syndrome, obstruction distal to ampulla, there is double bubble sign, and what kind of duodeno-duodenostomy is done? It's the diamond shaped duodeno-duodenostomy. Now we are going to discuss jejuno-ileal atresia. Very easy question, that out of jejuno-ileal atresia, there can be jejunal atresia also, ileal atresia also. So which one is more common? So if we see jejunal atresia, it's more common than ileal atresia. Okay, and in majority of cases, means in 80 to 90% cases, you will find that there is isolated atresia. So in jejuno-ileal atresia, generally there is isolated atresia in 80 to 90% cases. Which one is more common? It's the jejunal atresia. And in how many cases multiple atresia is seen? 10 to 20% cases. So in 10 to 20% cases, we are going to find the multiple atresia. There is one question which is frequently asked in relation to jejuno-ileal atresia, and this was asked many times in NEET PG. See the classification of jejuno-ileal atresia. So in type 1, you can see that there is membranous atresia with intact mesentery. Can you see? Mesentery is intact. So membranous atresia with intact mesentery, type 1. If you see type 2 here, the blind ends are separated by a fibrous cord. Can you see this? Blind ends are separated by fibrous cord. 3 is further divided into 3A and 3B. These are most commonly asked. In 3A, can you see the blind ends are separated by V-shaped defect in the mesentery. So blind ends are separated by what kind of defect? V-shaped defect in mesentery. You can notice here. And most commonly asked is type 3B. Why? Because of its typical appearance. Can you see? It is looking like apple peel. So this is known as apple peel atresia or Christmas tree atresia. And this is type 3B. So this is apple peel atresia, also known as Christmas tree atresia. Christmas tree atresia. Okay, type 3B. And if you see type 4, here can you see? You can see that there is multiple atresia and it looks like string of sausages. So this is known as string of sausages appearance, and that's type 4. So this is string of sausages appearance. So these are four types. Let's revise quickly. Type 1 is membranous atresia with intact mesentery. Type 2 we discussed blind and separated by fibrous cord, and there was V-shaped defect in mesentery in type 3A. Type 3B is apple peel atresia or Christmas tree atresia, and in type 4 there were multiple atresia giving rise to string of sausages. What was the image based question asked in NEET PG? Now here you can see this is the proximal end which is distended because there is atresia, and this is the distal end. And can you see the appearance? This is like apple peel. So this is apple peel atresia or Christmas tree atresia. This is the most commonly asked question. And what kind of atresia it is? This is type 3B of jejuno-ileal atresia. Now the problem, since there is intestinal atresia, jejuno-ileal atresia, these patients are having signs and symptoms of small bowel obstruction. And if patient is having small bowel obstruction, there can be vomiting, there can be abdominal distension, there can be both also. Generally, vomiting is more prominent in proximal obstructions. Abdominal distension is more common in distal obstruction. So what happens after birth? Generally on first day only, these patients are having bilious vomiting. So see the clinical features. In patients of jejuno-ileal atresia, there is bilious vomiting on first day itself. Bilious vomiting on first day. So just after birth, there is bilious vomiting. Vomiting is more common in proximal obstruction. Abdominal distension is more common in distal obstruction. See, more than 60% patients of jejuno-ileal atresia, they are not able to pass meconium on first day. So generally, they don't pass meconium. Not able to pass meconium on first day. Okay, diagnosis. So we can make the diagnosis by X-ray, and on X-ray there is presence of dilated bowel loops. Clear? We have indirect evidence during antenatal period, and we discussed that if the patient is having congenital gastrointestinal abnormality, there is maternal history of polyhydramnios. So these, in such patients also there is maternal history of polyhydramnios. Okay, now see, this patient is having small bowel obstruction, so we are going to manage these patients like small bowel obstruction. What we have to resuscitate the patient, so we give IV fluids, IV antibiotics, we go for proximal nasogastric aspiration or decompression, and we perform exploratory laparotomy. So whatever the atretic segment is there, we have to resect that and we have to perform the anastomosis. So see the treatment. So the treatment is IV fluids and IV antibiotics. We go for proximal gastric decompression. After exploratory laparotomy, we have to resect the atretic segment and we go for anastomosis. So this is how we manage the patients of jejuno-ileal atresia. Now we are going to discuss small intestinal duplication, and what is the other name? It is also known as duplication cyst. So what are these duplication cysts? These are mucosa lined structures in relation to or in continuity with GIT. So these are mucosa lined structures in continuity with GIT. What is the most common site? You can see the most common site is ileum. Ileum. And generally where exactly? Within the layers of mesentery. So can you see, this is the mesentery, these are the layers of mesentery, and this is the part of ileum. See the cut section? So this is the part of ileum. So this is the most common site, ileum within the layers of mesentery. Okay, now important points related to small intestinal duplication. Duplication means there are two lumen or duplication cyst. See, these cysts are having, or this duplication is having all the three layers. So first, in the wall there are all the three layers, and can you see it is located over which aspect? So it is present over the mesenteric aspect. Another important point here, you can notice that this is the wall, this is the normal lumen, means this is a GIT, and this is the lumen of cyst. So can you see what is shared? You can notice that there is shared wall. And if you see the vascular supply, what? Even the vascular supply is also shared. So three important points. First, that duplication cyst is having all the three layers. It is having shared wall and shared vascular supply. And what is the location? It is located along the mesenteric aspect. See, this is the typical description of cystic duplication cyst. There is another duplication cyst which is known as tubular. Overall, which one is more common? Cystic duplication cyst is responsible for 75% cases, which we discussed here, and there is tubular duplication which is responsible for 25% cases. Okay, so see the differences. It is of two types: cystic duplication and tubular. Clear? Cystic duplication, it is responsible for 75% cases. So this is the most common type, and tubular, this is responsible for 25% cases. Clear? So here you noticed that this cystic duplication, this is cystic, it doesn't communicate with the GI lumen. We discussed that this is the mucosa line structure in continuity with GIT. So what is the mucosa lining the small bowel? It's the columnar epithelium, and in this columnar epithelium there is presence of what? Goblet cells also. So these goblet cells are going to produce what? Mucin. So what happens over a period of time? There is production of mucin, and this mucin keeps on collecting within the cyst. And if mucin keeps on collecting within the cyst, what happens? The size of cyst is going to increase, and it is going to compress the lumen of bowel. So it leads to partial small bowel obstruction. Clear? So related to cystic duplication, first, it doesn't communicate. It doesn't communicate with gastrointestinal lumen. Okay, and it leads to partial small bowel obstruction. So because of this partial small bowel obstruction, what are the clinical features? These patients are having recurrent abdominal pain and there is vomiting. So what are the manifestations? It leads to recurrent abdominal pain and vomiting. Simple. Now see the tubular duplication. So this is the tubular duplication. What you can notice that it communicates with GI lumen. So if the proximal part of duplication communicates with GI lumen, it's known as proximal duplication. And if this is the proximal part, this is the distal part, and if this distal part communicates, this is known as distal duplication. Okay, what is the problem in the tubular duplication? That there is presence of ectopic gastric mucosa. And if there is presence of ectopic gastric mucosa, what's the problem? Can you see? This is ectopic gastric mucosa. So because of this ectopic gastric mucosa, there is production of what? Acid. And this acid is going to cause what? Ulcer. Clear? So there is ulcer. So in the ileum there is ulcer. Because of this ulcer there is bleeding leading to hematochezia. So what is the problem here? It leads to bleeding leading to hematochezia. Clear? So tubular duplication communicates with GI lumen. So see here, it communicates with GI lumen. And the problem that there is presence of ectopic gastric mucosa, and because of this ectopic gastric mucosa there is production of acid, and this acid leads to ulceration, and because of this ulcer, what's the problem? It can lead to bleeding. So manifestation is what? Bleeding. That's hematochezia. Okay, so what are the clinical features? You can see there is recurrent abdominal pain, vomiting. These features are suggestive of partial small bowel obstruction. Then it favors the cystic duplication, and if there is hematochezia or bleeding, it favors the tubular duplication because there is presence of ectopic gastric mucosa. We discussed just like this cystic duplication, a thing in peritoneum. So what was that? mesenteric cyst, it was almost identical. And what was the investigation of choice for diagnosis? It was CCT. So in patients of small intestinal duplication also, investigation of choice for diagnosis is CCT. Second, in Meckel's diverticulum, we discussed that if there is ectopic gastric mucosa, which investigation is done? Technetium pertechnetate scan. So here, if we suspect ectopic gastric mucosa with CT, we also go for technetium pertechnetate scan. So how we go for the diagnosis, or how we make the diagnosis? Investigation of choice for diagnosis, and that is CCT. So for duplication cyst, it is CCT, and if we suspect ectopic gastric mucosa, we go for technetium pertechnetate scan. Technetium pertechnetate scan for ectopic gastric mucosa. And on ultrasound, there is a characteristic appearance, triple layer effect, which is seen. So on ultrasound, there is triple layer effect in duplication cyst. So triple layer effect. Okay, now see the management. Imagine that this is the ileum, this is the mesentery, and this patient is having duplication. Clear? What kind of duplication? If there is involvement of short segment of bowel. So if there is short segment duplication, in that case we go for resection and anastomosis. So first, patient is having short segment duplication, and for this short segment duplication we go for resection and anastomosis. Okay. Second, imagine that the patient is having long segment duplication. It's something like this. Clear? In long segment duplication, if we go for resection and anastomosis, what's the problem? There is short bowel syndrome. So in these cases, we have two options. Either we perform multiple enterotomy with stripping of mucosa so that the cyst is going to collapse on its own, or sometimes we insert the stapler and we fire the stapler. So insert the stapler and fire so that whatever the wall is in between, that wall is divided. So see how we manage. For long segment duplication, either we perform multiple enterotomy with stripping of mucosa. Okay, stripping of mucosa. And the second option is that we are going to divide the wall by stapler. So division of common wall by stapler. Common wall by stapler. Clear? So this is how we manage the patients of duplication cyst.